So this part of the notes is going to finish up our factorials material for the course. I'm going to return to the example that we were talking about last week. Actually, we had a different example that we went through, but I did want to review this in the textbook. So some of the screencast lecture today is actually going to be coming from the textbook because there aren't any notes from the textbook on this stuff, but I wanted to make sure and cover it well. So going back to the Amelie data, this is from an example previously, example 10.1 in the book. This is a three-factor model. If you recall, we had actually gone over this very briefly in class. Here's the original. It comes from chapter 8 originally, but we've got temperature, variety, and growth temperature. We had looked at this in class. It was somewhat complex, and so I said, well, we'll get back to this later. Beginning in chapter 10, which is the last chapter on factorials. He has really 3 chapters. Chapter 8, where he introduces factorials. Chapter 9, where he gives you more material on factorials. And chapter 10, where it says, and a little bit more about factorials. Here we're looking at different sums of squares like we talked about last week. So the sum of squares, these would be like type 2 sums of squares because they're for anything but C in this case, especially the last term would be strictly. But we can see the hierarchy of the sum of squares, and then we can see how they can differ. And so this is where it first, that type 1, that type 2, that type 3 sum of squares that we dealt with last week gets introduced. So then when he picks back up this example, he's talking about the use of type 2 sum of squares in this kind of situation. Remember last time in class we did talk about how to obtain type 2 sum of squares in R. And here he has SAS, where it's pretty easy to get all the sums of squares since they kind of originally came up with this idea of presenting the sums of squares in these varying forms. And so we can see our type 2 sum of squares in this case. Let's compare and contrast the type 2, which are in this first section labeled 1, and the type 3 here. And then we'll talk about this contrast and talk about what kind of sum of square is that exactly, okay? So type 2 sum of squares, we do see some differences, particularly on the effect here for the G-temp, the terms involving G-temp. And so we see here that G-temp, recall that's the growth temperature, that there does appear to be some kind of association with the growth temperature and these other 2 factors involved in the experiment. However, if we start at the very bottom of our factors and look at that 3-factor interaction with either the type 2 or the type 3, we see no significant interaction at that level. However, when we get to the growth temp and variety, we do see with both cases significant interaction. So we know we need that particular interaction in the model. Now, considering that we have some disagreement between the type 2 and type 3 sums of squares, it could be a little difficult to formulate the rest of the model, but it's pretty clear that we're going to need that G-temp and variety interaction, and along with at least that main effect for A-temp. Now, how far we want to go with the interactions is a little open for interpretation here. Another thing that he talks about in this section is the use of contrasts. And because of how contrasts are constructed, remember they're formulated out of the full model, so that's with all effects assumed. Okay, so what's the sum of squares where we take into account all effects in the computation of the effect measures? That would be type 3. Okay, so with type 3 sums of squares, anytime we have a contrast, we know that that sum of square associated with that contrast is going to be type 3. And so we can interpret it as a type 3, which actually is, should at this point be a little comforting to you that all these contrasts we've been doing have not been leading us astray, because we have been using them, and I think we've used them already on some unbalanced data. And it's proper to interpret these as type 3. There's a little, maybe read through this on your own. This is an interesting example that he goes through here. It's good to know and understand the issues involved. And ask me if you have any questions. Goes into a little bit more about testing hypotheses with two-factor experiments, particularly when the two factors are binary. A little bit more about that unbalanced data puzzle. Where am I trying to get to here? Empty cells. I'm not going to talk about that particularly, but do read through it. I did want to get to this section 10.2 though. I really appreciate that he includes this because honestly, when I was going through experimental design, it never occurred to me at the time that this issue that he brings up, but it did later as I started doing research into multiplicity corrections and how they use and get used and don't get used in a lot of data analysis. So we talked a lot in a past chapter about the use of multiple comparisons, and we really focused in on some specific sets of comparisons like pairwise comparisons, comparison back to a control. We also talked about maybe, if you have a set of contrasts, you can use something like a Bonferroni adjustment to control for multiplicity among that particular a priori set of comparisons. So what's interesting is we've gotten through this whole section on factorials, and what you might have noticed is when we're analyzing a factorial, we often do a lot of f-tests to compare models, to compare the fit of models individually, or compare the fit by doing that ratio variance test between the models itself. We've done that in class. And you'll routinely do that on your project, on your homework, where you use multiple f-tests. And it didn't occur to me until I'd been doing this for some time of, wait, we do multiplicity corrections when we're doing t-tests, but why not the f-tests when we do the model comparison f-tests? And I remember looking it up and trying to find out some written explanation for this at one point in my life. I finally went and asked my dissertation director, and she basically said, yeah, there's really not a great reason why we don't do this. It's not the assumed practice. And Gary agrees. He says here, why is there a resounding silence when we're so careful to describe and account for multiple testing for pairwise comparisons? I have no good answer. Common statistical practice seems inconsistent in this regard. Okay, so this is kind of a breach of practice, I'd say. We seem quite accustomed to applying multiplicity controls to t-test results when we're making our final conclusions from an estimated model, but kind of ignore the fact that that estimated model we get to is actually formulated by a bunch of hypothesis testing. So talk about compounding of error. If you do 5 tests to come up with the right model, you've compounded your error 5 times. And then the probability of a type 1 error on any one of those f-tests or chi-square tests or whatever kind of tests you do is quite probable. This is something I focus on actually after I realized this. My first methodology I came up with was actually quite good for this, because our tests, when we're comparing nested or hierarchical models, our tests are going to be highly dependent, because the result, the f-test of one model will be highly correlated to what you get as your f-test result for the next model. So they are not independent by assumption, pretty much. And so my methods I work on actually deal with those, accounting for those kinds of dependent structures. So I've been trying to make the case for years in the literature that this needs to be done. I guess I'm not very convincing because I don't feel like people listen very much or care very much about this issue, but it is something that certainly affects the reliability and validity of the models we choose. Yes, it's good to still apply our pairwise comparisons at the end of the model too, and whether you should do that in a unified fashion where you spread out your error among all the F tests getting to the final model, and then also for your, say, pairwise comparisons, or if you do those separately, I'm less concerned with that. I'd just really like to see people using error control for model selection. Let's talk a little bit about that in class, particularly if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you or if you have questions about it. Let's see what else there is. He talks a little bit about power and sample size calculations. For factorial data, we usually test the null effects about the main effects or the interactions in addition to that overall no model effects, like the model just doesn't have any explanatory power at all. So power for these depends on your type 1 error rate overall, your numerator denominator degrees of freedom, your effect sizes that you assume, your sample sizes, and your error variance through the non-centrality parameter for that F distribution, right? So this is related very much to the power calculations we did. When you have unbalanced data, those power calculations we did are not any longer valid. We'll often assume we're going to have balanced data do our power calculations, and then when you actually get the data, sometimes, you have dropout or things happen, and then you end up with unbalanced. I don't really worry about that too much, to tell you the truth. But if you know by design that you're not going to have balanced data, I really strongly encourage you to use a simulation-based method. I almost always use simulation-based methods now anyway because they are a gold standard and they're pretty easy to do now. We'll talk about that more towards the end of the course. I will say too, one other thing, because I just did this the other day. I did a power analysis for a two-factor experiment, and you get power calculations for the overall model, which is usually what the funding agencies want you to report. So if you're doing a power analysis for an NIH study, they usually just want to see what's the overall power for the overall statistical model. So you can say, okay, to achieve 90% power in a two-factor model, I need 10 subjects per treatment group, okay, for a particular data configuration. But some funding agencies, or for some studies, you may actually want to investigate the power associated with a particular main effect, especially if it's like a primary factor in your analysis, or particular interaction effects. If you're really highly focused in on finding a significant interaction, I would probably provide both the global model power calculation as well as the interaction. Again, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here. This is maybe a thing we can do. It probably should be incorporated into your project now that I'm thinking about this. So let me kind of get my stuff together, and then we'll talk about this later this week to kind of finish up factorials. I can show you some calculations in R, in fact, the ones I just used on a different study, and maybe we could try that out in class and do our power calculations for our study. And that would be a good exercise for you, and also make sure our study has validity and requisite power. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We're not actually done with factorials yet. I think I'm on part 8 now for factorials. So one more set of notes, and then I promise we'll be done, and we'll be looking at what I just promised, the power calculations for our project, and then we'll be starting on mixed models. We'll see if we get to that this week. If not, no biggie.